Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you very much for giving me this slot today to update you on what's going on in the US market. I've gathered a few insights from my American colleagues as well, so I'll be combining those in with the presentation. This will, of course, be a sort of short whirlwind through a few of the key issues within the US, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Here you'll see these are a few of the issues I'm just going to cover today. So solar wars, very relevant for the US at the moment. Coal comeback question mark, I'll give you an idea of that. Are we about to approach the decade of batteries? And I did hear in the panel discussion there was some mention of Elon Musk. That's about the only thing I could pick up. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Microgrid and smarter grid. Electricity, the new oil, and the continued rise of smart water. So quite a diverse selection here, but I know we have quite a diverse audience. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So solar wars is the first thing to highlight. I don't know how many of you follow what's been going on in the US, but there's been quite a lot of activity at the moment. Several US companies brought a trade case against Chinese importers because Chinese importers have been flooding the US market, and it's made it very challenging for domestic manufacturers to compete. President Trump has ultimately sided with the decision of the tariff board and has imposed a 30% tariff on solar modules. This is partly through his desire to be seen to be supporting American business and the American worker. It's divided the industry because, of course, it is beneficial for anybody manufacturing solar within the country, but it's a negative not just for the Chinese trying to sell into the market, but it's actually a negative for those companies that are installing solar because they are potentially seeing demand go lower. It's also interesting, of course, that this won't actually mean a significant number of jobs actually within the US, and it will potentially lead to a net job loss because most solar factories now, the new ones being built certainly, are largely automated. So the amount of staff you're taking on is relatively low. And obviously, if you're not installing solar cells, that is still relatively labor-intensive high. Another impact of this will be actually the potential for Chinese companies to invest in the US, and we're already seeing some signs of companies are thinking about opening plants there. We had discussions ourselves with a company called Jinko Solar that is now looking at whether to operate in the US. And there's also the potential for plants in India and other countries that are actually exempt from the Chinese tariffs to also start selling into the US market. So it's an interesting one at the moment. If we go to the next slide, we'll actually see sort of our projections for how we see the solar market going. So 2016 was a phenomenal growth year versus 15, and we already saw the market weakening into 17. President Trump's announcement has certainly taken the steam out of the market. Previous expectations before this case came up was that solar would probably be more at 17 levels going forward, and we are going to see some declines as those extra prices hit. But interestingly, what we do see as well is that the residential sector, which I'll come on to talk to, is a little bit more resilient. It has taken a bit of a hit, but will only decline a small amount. And we do see utility scale solar making a comeback into the 2020s back towards this 2016 level. As I say, this is a recent forecast. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the coming year. But I think while demand for solar will be maybe 15% lower than it would have been before, we still see quite a lot of investment. And a positive element in this is that a lot of states, around 35 states, still have renewable energy targets to meet. And there's still a lot of support for solar from states like California, Arizona, Colorado, all those sort of Sunbelt states. So it's not as negative maybe as people first feared, and the sort of death of the industry is certainly not about to happen. So if we move on then, so what does this mean for other forms of generation? Well, you'll obviously probably recognize this from the campaign. President Trump is a strong supporter of coal, is very keen to see to support coal-fired generation. A lot of his supporters, or a significant proportion of supporters where he really won in places like Pennsylvania, came from coal communities. What we've actually found in 2017 is around 18 gigawatts of coal capacity actually closed. This is from a US total of a bit under 300. So we're still talking about a significant percentage in 1 year shutting down. And it's unlikely that coal's going to make much of a comeback. If we move to the next slide, we get a bit more an idea about where some of the investment is going. Up to between now and 2030, we see 2/3 of investment going towards wind and solar still, despite the president's antipathy, I would say, towards wind and indifference to solar. We see really that coal has largely disappeared. We don't have any utilities really planning to open new coal plants, and we see the rate of closures will still be 10 to 12 gigawatts. So we see, possibly that would equate to maybe 10 large coal plants going offline every year. There's some old assets there. So unless we see a dramatic turnaround in things such as carbon capture and storage, which is not looking likely at the moment, then coal will become a far less significant share of US energy. The other investment will be, we do have some bioenergy in the US hydro. There's still some investment there. Hydro very mature, and we also will have natural gas still coming online because of low gas prices. And towards the end of this longer forecast period, so the late 2020s, it will be to replace some of the old aging plants. If we move to the next slide, you can just get an idea how the mix looks in the US and how things change. And as you can see there, coal is going to be approximately 50%. The capacity will be about 50% of what it is in 2017 by 2030. A very dramatic change. And you can see how much solar and wind, the two at the bottom, will have gained. So they will be, in around 30%, 35% installed capacity, a lower amount of overall electricity generation. Is important to say in the US, this will differ depending on the states. So you already are seeing relatively high penetrations in places like California, Arizona that I mentioned. New York State is very, very supportive of renewables with a recent raft of policy measures announced. So that's one important thing probably to highlight with the US market, is obviously it does tend to differ considerably. The coal producing states in the middle are likely to support coal for longer, but we see particular adoption of cleaner technologies on the coast. If we move onwards then, we now can get a little bit of a comment on batteries. Will it be the decade of batteries? We've obviously seen Tesla, and I had some reference to it earlier on, launching their sort of consolidated and PV battery offering. This is already being replicated by other suppliers in the US. We had Daimler last year. We worked with Daimler, and they launched a residential storage offering in the US, interestingly, considering likely to do the same in Europe. And a lot of the car companies are getting involved. Tesla, interesting, I was reading just a few days ago, Tesla is now as big as Ford is, and it took them 8 years to get there. So that's an aside. If I move on to the next slide, you'll get an idea here of just where we see the residential market going. So this was some research work that we did last year that we're updating again this year. I suspect the market has probably grown even more since then, and probably our projections will be higher. But from a relatively small number of units in the US, we're going to see over 100,000 installed in 2022, and that is rapidly increasing every year. I think the projections are probably higher. Now it'll overtake Germany as the largest residential market in Europe. There's also very strong growth potential in the commercial industrial storage. And also, I would say, grid scale storage propositions are likely to become increasingly common as we get into the, I would say, early mid 2020s. We will see grid solar with storage. We'll also see wind engaging with storage. So we definitely see quite considerable growth in the US there. Moving on then to microgrids and smart grids. I've just put some numbers up here to show the sort of growth in microgrids. So it's going from being a sort of $2 billion market to nearly a $2 billion in 2015. So we actually are around 2.5 now, but getting up to nearly a $6 billion market in 2022. There's a lot of investment in the US driven by sort of a combination of extreme weather incidents, which is really encouraging grid resiliency, security concerns, and that's driven a lot of investment, particularly in defence, the defence realm, and just the general growth in distributed energy. So we see more and more distributed energy providers developing microgrid propositions, looking to combine microgrids so they can operate semi-autonomously with other assets. And it's been a big growth area in the last couple of years, actually much bigger than Europe, which is lagging a little bit behind here. This is also part of a wider story in the US of continued smart grid investment, more to replace and refurbish rather than extend the network. But we see a lot of the distribution network operators there. They're able actually to invest probably easier than many European countries. The rate paying case is quite strong for them. They can add it on to the rates that people pay, and they tend to focus very much on investment that can bring a quick return on investment. So things such as distribution automation, substation automation, high voltage connections between wind assets and population centres, things that can generate a fairly quick return on investment by increasing the intelligence of the grid, are particularly attractive. If we move on then, our next area is electricity, the new oil. This is quite an interesting trend. It's occurring in Europe as well, but we're seeing a lot of the oil companies are now actively driving investment in renewables. They what would the word be? Dallied, did a little bit of activity more in the 2000s, but we saw a pullback from that, particularly in the era of higher oil prices. But we are now seeing the likes of Shell, BP, ExxonMobil investing, particularly in wind, but also in commercial solar as well. This, as I say, applies to assets in the US. In Europe, just as an aside, we've seen Shell buy the 7th biggest electricity utility in the UK, which is a very interesting development, local to me. But in general, they are getting a lot more interested in developing renewables. And I think we will see that trend grow, and we will see more oil majors and probably even some of the second tier oil companies in the US looking more at how they can maybe transfer their activity a little bit over to developing wind projects. Finally, we have water. So yes, the continued drive for smart water. Interesting here. I mean, the US is already one of the most established metering markets. Smart metering is obviously quite a key component of establishing really an ultimate smart water grid. The US is around 50% of the market at the moment. Every year has certainly the highest penetration of all the global markets, certainly for water. And what we see here in the US, larger utilities are increasingly looking at what they can do using the cloud, but also actually water quality and monitoring is becoming important. Maybe a few of you are aware of the Flint sort of scandal in Michigan. My colleague was telling me a bit about it. I'd heard a bit about it, but it hadn't maybe made the news big here in the UK, but there were obviously a lot of incidents there around the pollution of water, and the water utility there obviously got high penalties, a lot of criticism. It was seen as a big concern in the US. So that has driven a lot of water utilities now to invest more in improving the quality and monitoring, which leads to more smart investment. Second one is smart agriculture. The droughts in the US, you're probably aware of some of the incidents that have gone on in California between fires and droughts, but they've had a lot of challenges in parts of the US. So investing on using water intelligently there is particularly attractive. But I think it's important to say, and this actually applies in the same way as it does for smart grid investment, same with smart water. Investments that can demonstrate a quick return on investment are always favoured. So things that can improve the overall efficiency, so the energy efficiency of water assets is one. Leakage, so anything that curbs water losses, leakage detection is another. Anything that protects sort of non-revenue water, so any cases where there's water theft, that's one of the reasons for investing in metering is also quite important. But certainly water is a big growth area in the US. I'll just give you a few summarizing comments now on the next slide, and then we'll take any questions. So firstly, I think renewable investment has taken a hit probably from where it was at the end of the Obama administration. but we still see wind and solar at relatively high levels compared with recent years. And I think it's important to say that 35 states do have renewable energy targets. So we could well see that the impact of the president's measures for solar may not even be as severe as we have generally forecast. My second sort of observation would be the EV PV storage access gaining fast. The growth of EVs we see accelerating in the coming years, EVs or hybrids. We see PV continuing to increase, particularly residential, and we see storage increasing. And a proposition that ties these in together will gradually become increasingly important as we go into the next decade. And my final one would be to say that the US is generally ahead of the rest of the world in grid investment, certainly in retrofitting grid technologies, and its ability to basically pass on the cost to the ratepayers is probably the key behind this. But as I said, in both cases, it's all about quick wins, good short ROI, stopping leakage, improving energy efficiency. These are all the key things that really drives investment in the US, but it's certainly an attractive smart grid space at the moment. Thank you for your time this morning. Very, very short presentation, I know, because you've got a lot to pack in, but happy to take any questions that come up now.